Press Club only. And if you have a phone on you, which I guess everybody does these days, and if you can turn it on silent at least, so we won't have an interruption, that'd be great. So I'm going to make a quick introduction of all three in case they have to speak. First, Jan is the director of the Louisiana Budget Project, which monitors and reports on state government spending and how it affects Louisiana's low to moderate income families. He's an award-winning journalist, formerly with New Orleans Times-Picayune, and he's had quite a background, having worked in Washington and also doing some work for a Las Vegas television station. And he was born in Sweden and raised in Pittsburgh. And then the deputy director is with us today too. Her name is Stacey Roussel, and she's the deputy director, and she brings about 20 years of experience in the public, academic, and nonprofit sectors, working on issues related to economic and community development, with experience in fundraising, strategic planning, program evaluation, and policy analysis. And then finally is Davante. Let's see, make sure I get to his bio. Davante Lewis is Director of Public Affairs and Outreach. And Davante focuses on higher education policy, monitoring legislative developments, and working with advocacy groups and coalition partners. He is their government relations person. So would you all welcome, Davante is going to speak until Jan gets here, and Stacey's ready to back him up if needed. So let's welcome all three of them, please. Thank y'all for coming.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Davante Lewis. As John said, I'm the Director of Public Affairs and Outreach at the Louisiana Budget Project. And so I should start off by who we are. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy think, and I like to add do tank, that works on issues that affect low and moderate income families in the state of Louisiana. But we do this through a particular lens that most don't talk about. We do it through the state budget and through our tax code, because we know where inequalities live is typically in how we budget and who we balance the budget off of. We are part of a national network under the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, State Priorities Partnership, which is made up of 43 independently research and advocacy firms that come collectively together to share research and data and strategies about how we improve the lives of Americans through fiscal policy and public policy. We research, we advocate, and we communicate as our three major pillars. But we do this in multiple ways. So we are just a research organization that solely looks at analyzing data. We also, as I talked about, we advocate and we write our own public policy. But we also have taken on a lens of administrative policy, because a lot of times when we talk about making direct changes in people's lives, we typically focus on the legislature. And if any of you have been around there, you know it's a very hard place to survive. I like to call the legislature a casino. You walk in, and by the time you walk out, you don't know what time it is. You probably don't know who you're going to run into, and most often you leave with less than what you walked in with. And so because of that, we have really moved to administrative advocacy, looking at ways that we can use administrative rules and flexibility and federal funds and grants and directives as a way to advance the needs of the people of Louisiana. But we've also made a significant commitment that we cannot talk about income inequality and poverty in the state of Louisiana if we do not talk about structural racism and how racism has played a role in public policy. We like to say that there is no such thing as a race-neutral policy. So if we are not examining policy by race and looking at the effects of policy on different racial demographics, we cannot make Louisiana more prosperous. And so we have been very committed to this. We've joined partnership recently with LSU's Riley Center, Southern University's Mandela School of Government, and the Louisiana chapter of the NAACP on a 2-year now journey embarking on understanding exactly how racism plays a role in all of our society. But we come today to talk about one of our favorite things. As we mentioned, our middle name is budget, and we are in the middle of the budget cycle and the budget season. And so we know right now Louisiana has an unprecedented opportunity to make investments in our people, in our future. We are now sitting around $3.4 billion of available excess cash through our surplus, through money from the American Rescue Plan, and our current year access. And we know for a fact that this number from 3.4 million will increase in a few weeks when the Revenue Estimating Conference meets to do it. And so we know that when it comes to making investments in our people, we have the resources. Oftentimes, when we hear people say, let's invest in our children, or in our workers, or in our communities, show me where the money is. That's always the question, right? Where's the resources? This moment in our history tells us we have the resources to make those investments in our people. The major question that faces us this legislative session is whether or not the governor and the legislature has the willpower to make those investments. And this is kind of like a deja vu moment for us. We had a similar moment like this. If you go back and flash back to 2009, 2010, we were recovering from 2 hurricanes. The American economy was tinkering, which means the federal government was giving us a lot of extra support. And tax collections in the state of Louisiana and oil was relatively high. And what did Louisiana do? We blew it. We passed massive tax cuts under Governor Jindal. We made a slush fund to attract corporate investments. And we did not invest enough money in infrastructure. And when I talk about infrastructure, I don't only mean our fiscal infrastructure, but we have to talk about our human infrastructure. That is the people, because our roads and bridges will not bring Louisiana to prosperity if people are not well off. And so we know in this moment, the first job that the legislators should do is do no harm to the state of Louisiana's fiscal restraint. And that is not to pass any new tax cuts. But unfortunately, we see a movement to do just so. We have seen multiple members, even though they have not introduced any bills this session, talk about the need to eliminate the personal income tax. If you think back to just a few years ago when we were trying to solve the budget deficit, we passed the 0.45 half sales tax penny that is due to roll off the books in 2025. Today alone, we had 2 pieces of legislation that have moved from the House floor, from House committee now to the House floor, that would, one, start to roll off that 0.45 early and start trickling it over years, which means next year our budget would be short around $92 million than what we already currently have. We saw another proposal today to move all of that 0.45, about $500 million, and put it into a fund that goes to roads and bridges. And so we're seeing these changes. We also saw in the Transportation Committee, there was a bill to basically find a way to put the gas tax on electric vehicles. And the proposal was to make it as a checkoff box on your personal income taxes, whether or not you had an electric vehicle, for the wait for the Office of Motor Vehicles to collect that information. And the chairman, Representative Wright, says, well, how do we do this if we eliminate the personal income tax? So we already see that there is a significant movement to squirrel away the money that we already have in our system. And that simply is just not what we should do. But the next question, if we aren't talking about tax cuts, is about where do we actually make those investments? How should we use the excess money? And who do we prioritize? I think this is a simple question, and we can say that the HB1, the executive budget, does some great things. I think for once we're starting to see the reinvestment in higher education. I got my start as a student body president in the late 2000s against Governor Jindal when higher education was getting cut. So it's kind of a full circle now to say higher education is doing somewhat well. But we've seen record investments in higher education. Investments in need-based aid. I think this is the most important. As we know, TOPS costs the state around $400 million, but only goes to about 25% of our population that is enrolled in a public 2-year or 4-year college. Go Grants, which is meant to be our need-based aid program, really centered around Pell Grants, and the MJ Foster Promise Program, which was established last year, which creates funding for students who go through certificate and credential programs. Because one of the things that most people don't know is there's no access to financial aid if you go through a credential or a certificate program, because they are excluded from Pell Grant and the state provides no funding, which means a lot of times when we are talking about increasing our workforce and all of the great things that BRCC, for example, is doing with their CDL license or their LPNs, those students had no access to financial assistance. So we saw some investments in those, but we can do more. And so at the Louisiana Budget Project, we released what we call the Recovery Agenda. As Louisiana comes back from Hurricanes Laura and Ida, as we are coming out of a global pandemic, we know the place that we should make the most investments is in our people. Now, the American Rescue Plan gave our state over $2 billion to allocate when you take away what was given to local governments. Last year we missed an opportunity. Instead of giving our essential workers a pay raise, instead of investing in public services, what did we do? We gave money to movie theaters. Was one of the biggest beneficiaries of our American Rescue Plan dollars. We put $500 million last year in the Unemployment Trust Fund, but we did not significantly raise the benefits that people receive when they are unemployed. We did not make it easier. Right now, for most of you who do not know, Louisiana has the lowest minimum weekly unemployment insurance benefit amount, which means by law, if you file for unemployment, the minimum you can receive by the Workforce Commission is $10. $10. We had the lowest maximum benefit at $267. So when we're talking about recovering and getting people back into the workforce, the investments were not in the movie theaters, they were in the people. But the Unemployment Trust Fund is not an investment actually in those people. So we know that Treasury said when they passed the American Rescue Plan, they encouraged funding to be used that fosters a strong, inclusive, and equitable recovery. And so when we are talking about that recovery, we wanted to say that we need to develop a budget that really helps people. And so some of the items that we decided that should be funded was emergency housing, that we know housing is a significant shortage. Right now in the state of Louisiana, if you wanted to afford a 2-bedroom apartment, on average, you would need to make $16.70. A 2-bedroom apartment requires that much money if you were going to live within that 30% of what you should allocate towards housing. We know that our weather is changing. Climate change is real. And so we decided that what we needed to do is focus on weatherization, that we should put some money into programs that really looked at how we are developing a sustainable Louisiana. We also talked about one of the things that we know to cut poverty, and we saw cut poverty, was direct payments to people, workers, and children. We should have used some of this money to create our own child tax credit and invest that money back into the people of Louisiana. So this was our proposal when it came towards what we should do. Now, we have seen the legislature thus far move the budget outside of the House, and sadly, none of these proposals are funded at the moment. But today is Public Testimony Day. We have staffers advocating for these investments. But while we're talking about the budget investment, I think it's also increasingly important that we do not lose sight of the other public policies that affect people. Just last week, we saw the House Labor Committee shoot down multiple proposals to raise the minimum wage, and we know one of the best ways to get people out of poverty is by increasing the minimum wage. We are increasingly happy that we know we should invest in paid leave and in sick time. And currently in the budget right now, we were successful in getting an amendment that added $500,000 for a study to be commissioned by the Louisiana Workforce Commission to start looking at the actuarial cost of what it would be to implement a paid leave program in the state of Louisiana. But while we talk about things that haven't been done, there is another area of concern where we have to watch, because we know the social safety net is important. And there's going to be two things that we are particularly interested in this session. I'm going to talk about one, and then I'll pass it over to my colleagues to discuss the other. And the other one is, right now we have a significant effort in this state to expand predatory lending, or the payday business. So far, we know that Payday drains nearly $145 million out of Louisiana's pockets in fines and fees when it comes to these loans. And so what is a payday loan? It's typically a short-term loan that you take out for about 1 to 2 months, somewhere between $30 to $350, but you carry an annual percentage rate of nearly 400%. If you go to check into cash in Louisiana and you take out a $300 loan, your APR is 1,000%. But what we're seeing right now is the payday industry is not trying to reform that product. They're coming with a new product that we call an installment loan. So we heard in committee that Community Choice, which owns most of our check into cashes in the state, had 45 open stores in the state before the global pandemic. They are down to 15 now. So what did they decide to do? Instead of recognizing the market is changing, they are creating now a loan program from $500 to $1,500, and they package it by saying, we're going to let you finance that over 12 months. But here's the kicker. If you have a loan over $400, you have a $50 underwriting fee. They charge you your annual 36% interest rate on that bill, and they would also add a 13% monthly maintenance fee that you would pay every month. So for example, if you took out $1,000, your maintenance fee each month would be $130. But that doesn't matter whether you're in the first month or the last month. So if you're at month 12, and you would only owe $100 on the principal amount of the loan, correct? You would pay that 36% interest. You would still pay $130 monthly maintenance fee, even though that now is lower than the balance owed. And we are seeing they have fast-tracked this bill. This bill has gone out of committee onto the Senate floor and onto the House in a matter of few weeks. And we know this would devastate families, especially in Thibodeau and Lake Charles, who are recovering from hurricane. This will devastate our individuals who are unemployed. So we have to talk about that infrastructure as well. But there's another challenge to our families outside of their economic state, and that is the public health. And so I'm going to bring up one of my colleagues to talk about one of the significant challenges that we have with the public health emergency and ensuring people have Medicaid. So, Jan, you wanna come up?
That's okay.
Sure.
Okay.
Do you want me to?
I will turn it over to Stacey in a second. Hi, everybody. Jan Moller, Executive Director. I apologize for being late. The legislature kept me busy this morning. I'm happy to report that the Revenue Estimating Conference is going to remain intact. There was a bill up there that we were watching that was trying to change that process a little bit. And again, I'm sorry to miss Davante's opening, but I guess what I wanted to kind of express from LBP's standpoint is, we know that this is a very strong year for the state budget. We have a lot of revenue available to spend on critical services. There's nobody really getting cut in this budget cycle. but we know that that is going to be very temporary. There are $3.4 billion available in excess funding on top of the revenue that we already have, and that's why we put out the recovery agenda. But I think the first thing we need to do is make sure that they don't do any harm at the legislature, because we know, I mean, there were stories in the paper this weekend that we are likely heading into a recession in the next couple of years. And the one thing we know from bitter experience in this state is that we have a tendency to pass big permanent tax cuts at a time when we think we can afford it, but we know that a year or two later, it's going to be a lot harder to balance the budget. So one of the reasons I'm late is because there was a bill that moved out of the Ways and Means Committee this morning that takes $426 million a year out of the state general fund, where it supports higher education, health care, social services, programs, and things that people need, and puts it into a special funds where it could only be used for roads and bridges. I'm not trying to say roads and bridges aren't important, but we're going to need that revenue to support education, health care, basic public services that are well funded now, but are going to be a lot harder to fund in a couple of years when this federal money runs out, when we don't have big surpluses as far as the eye can see. So our message really for the legislator and for anybody who's listening is number one, don't make any permanent changes to tax policy this year in a non-fiscal year. If you want to have a conversation about revenues, there's an opportunity to do that next year in a fiscal session, because certainly there is a sales tax rolling off the books in state government, and we're going to have to find a way to replace that $500 million in revenue, or we are going to have a big fiscal cliff. And then let's talk about how we can use this $3.5 billion, and that number is going to grow next year, to talk about investments that can center people, center the populations that were hurt the most by the COVID pandemic, by all the disruptions we've had in recent years. So I would encourage anybody watching or listening to read the recovery agenda. This was something we put together with our partners, and it's meant to really put some suggestions out there for how the legislature can use these unprecedented resources, not just to build infrastructure, which is an important need of the state, but also to invest in people, and especially in frontline workers. With that, I want to leave time for Q&A, but I also want to give Stacey Roussel, our Deputy Executive Director, a chance to talk about a big change that's coming to the Medicaid program starting later this year that I don't think a lot of folks have been talking about, but it really is going to affect hundreds of thousands of people in Louisiana, potentially, who get their health care insurance through the Medicaid program. So, Stacey?
Thank you so much, Jan. I'll be brief so that we can get to question and answer. Later on this year, we anticipate that the public health emergency that has been in effect since January of 2020 will eventually come to an end. And when that happens, the protections that state Medicaid programs have been extending to people enrolled in Medicaid will also come to an end. When the COVID-19 pandemic began, the federal government knew very quickly that they needed to inject money into state budgets to help in what was really an unknown future. And we also knew that going into a public health emergency, it was incredibly important to make sure that low and moderate income, especially low income folks who qualify for Medicaid, stayed covered. That has worked the way it was supposed to. But when the public health emergency ends, we'll go through a period of redetermining the eligibility of everyone on Medicaid. That is about 4 in every 10 Louisianans right now. We have nearly 2 million people on the rolls for Medicaid. It has grown by a little over 300,000 since the beginning of the pandemic, as people lost their jobs and experienced financial hardship and were eligible for the program. So we'd like to raise the awareness now as the current public health emergency is set to end at the middle of July. The Biden administration has told states that they will have 60 days notice before the public health emergency is allowed to expire. So in a couple of weeks, we'll find out if we'll be facing that end in the middle of July or a little bit further down the road. But when it comes, we will be redetermining eligibility for low-income households in Louisiana for their health insurance coverage. This is going to be the biggest health insurance coverage event that we have seen since the ACA was passed in 2010. So it's very important that we get this right and that we ensure that people who are eligible remain on the rolls. Thank you all so much for the invitation to speak today.
We'd be happy to take any questions.
Jan, and perhaps Stacey's expertise as well. The FMAP that props up the state budget was generously expanded under the COVID thing. What impact does that have on the fiscal cliff?
Well, so the legislature, the question was about, in exchange for, Louisiana got extra Medicaid match from the federal government, and that's been in place for over 2 years now. And what happens to the fiscal cliff when the enhanced match goes away? That is accounted for in House Bill 1, in the budget bill. I believe the last number was around $650 million in extra state costs having to do with the FMAP. The good news is we have the money to sustain that in next year's budget. But again, it's one more reason why we shouldn't be relying on the current revenue forecast to pay for tax cuts that are going to be very quickly unaffordable. So the FMAP drop comes at a very good time. It's not going to be like it was, I think, around 2010 when the last time we faced this problem.
Could you talk more about what the process for reevaluating eligibility will look like for Medicaid?
Yeah, I think that's a Stacey question.
The short answer, thank you for the question. The short answer is that there's a lot still to be worked out. So CMS has been issuing guidance over the duration of the public health emergency to states as to how they need to handle the unwinding. Louisiana has very wisely said that it will take 9 to 12 months to fully redetermine the eligibility of everyone on the rolls. There are guidelines from CMS, but there's also some wiggle room. CMS also has recognized that among states, there's a lot of different steps that we can take, and so they've issued a checklist and said to states, please let us know within 45 days of the public health emergency ending which of all of these different ways that you could help to eliminate accidentally disenrolling someone who is eligible. Let us know what you're going to do. And so it's really our position at Louisiana Budget Project that we'd like the state to check every box on that checklist, to do all that we can. There's also some other pieces that we don't talk about as much when it comes to Medicaid, which is the marketplace. So in Louisiana, we use healthcare.gov. We have about 100,000 folks who are covered through that. And under ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act, we have enhanced federal subsidies, which really drastically lowers the cost of health insurance in the marketplace through the end of this year. If Congress decides to act, then we could see those subsidies extended further. But basically what you're finding is that if people are just right above that threshold for Medicaid eligibility, there are very affordable options right now in the marketplace. So it's important that we transition people smoothly and also ensure that people who are eligible stay enrolled.
Yes, sir.
One of the perennial wild cards in the state's budgeting is oil and gas revenue. Is there a better way to do it? Have you looked into it?
Well, the question was about oil and gas revenue. Well, the good news and bad news about oil and gas revenue is we're not nearly as dependent on those revenues as we once were, because the oil and gas industry is a lot smaller than it used to be. There's a slide I use in my presentations that I stole from Jay Darden about 4 years ago, and it showed that in 1982, 42% of the state's general fund came from oil and gas revenue, and right now it's a little bit over 4%. We get more revenue from gambling than, almost twice as much revenue from gambling as we do from oil and gas extraction, and it's probably not going to change. So, or at least not change significantly. So we, I forget what the exact number was. Every $10 change in the oil and gas is X amount of revenue for the state, but it doesn't affect us quite as much as it used to. And so I think probably the status quo. I think the big question is really how are we going to, and that's been the question really for the state budget for 40 plus years, is how do you replace all the revenue that used to come from oil and gas? That's why we have temporary sales taxes. That's how we got the gambling industry in Louisiana. We've done a lot of crazy things with our tax system to try to make up for that money that used to come from a major industry that is just not as major as it once was. And really, at the Budget Project, we're very interested in the transition, because I think in the next 20 years, the energy industry in Louisiana, but really in the country, is going to look very, very different, and hopefully Louisiana will be poised to benefit from that transition and not be hurt by it. That's Blake.
What is, I imagine the Budget Project would be in favor of extending the temporary sales tax because it's regressive in nature. I'm wondering what your recommendations or thinking is on what should happen.
So we supported the clean penny in 2016 because the state was facing a $2 billion fiscal crisis, and there was really, it was a question of whether you pass a temporary sales tax or you turn out the lights at a university. That was supposed to buy time to find a better solution. And then 2 years later, they hadn't agreed on a solution, so we renewed half the sales tax. And we bought 5 more years. And now it's up in 2023. Our position is we would love to see another better way to raise that $500,000 to support basic public services, because the sales tax is a regressive tax that falls, which means it falls harder on low and moderate income families than the wealthy. But what we don't want to do is see a $500 million drop out of the state fisc, because that's going to mean drastic cuts. It's going to make it harder to educate children, to pay doctors and hospitals and other healthcare providers. So we look forward to having a conversation in next year's fiscal session. And again, that if you want to talk about cutting taxes, you need to talk about replacing that revenue. Because we are not a state that is overtaxed. When you look at our tax burden compared to other states, we in fact don't raise enough revenue to support the basic needs that we have. So hopefully there'll be a conversation. We should look at the tax exemption budget. We should look at the personal and corporate income taxes. There are lots of other ways besides the sales tax for the state to raise the money it needs. But that conversation needs to happen when the Constitution says it can happen, and that is the fiscal session we have coming up next spring.
And Jan, if I may add, for you, that is part of our Invest in Louisiana agenda, right? Is about ways. We articulated this last year with Amendment 2. We were very vocal that we should have used the $986 million from eliminating the federal deduction to roll off the half penny and then invest that money back into tax credits that we know work for people, which was an extension, or expansion, I should say, of their earned income tax credit and the child tax credit. But sadly, the legislature chose to lower personal income taxes. So we're going to come back, I think, with the same proposals that we had, which is a millionaire's bracket, amending the Constitution, putting in a capital gains tax and an estate tax. We're one of the states that doesn't have an estates tax. So there's a lot of different proposals that have been presented to the legislature, not only by the commission, but by us, that we hope are in those conversations. And we have until 2025, and I think that's the way, is getting at people to recognize that we don't have to renew the state sales tax. We're doing that by choice because the legislature refuses to do adequate tax reform that centers low and moderate income people over the wealthy and the rich in the state.
What he said. Any other, yes, Bill?
Is there any latest definitive word on the federal money we're allegedly getting for disaster recovery? It's kind of a hokey-pokey thing for a while. There was some in and it wasn't in, and we got this unexpected $1.3 billion. I don't know, is it definitive as to that it has to go to specific projects, or does it go to the general fund?
I don't have a specific answer to that. I've been following the news reports the same as you. My understanding is that Lake Charles did not get everything, or isn't close to getting everything that it needs, and that they're, I think they're still hoping to get money into. Davante may know, into if there's a budget bill. I mean, there'll be some kind of budget bill, I'm assuming, passed before the August recess.
There were some talks among with Speaker Pelosi to try to add this into what would have been the second COVID relief package that they have been working on. I think those negotiations with the Senate right now are up in the air because it doesn't seem to be a viable path at this moment. But I know there were some talks, especially in this energy bipartisan package that Senator Manchin says that he is working on. I mean, I think this is kind of be one of the sticking points. Some of the Senate Democrats would rather do this for reconciliation and through an energy package through reconciliation, where we would probably see additional disaster money come into. But those talks right now are kind of on the fence while Senator Manchin works through this bipartisan negotiation that he thinks can happen. And so I think it's kind of just really in flux, but there are provisions that are being looked at. I think, but this has been the major question of hurricane relief money for Louisiana the last 3 years. There's multiple avenues, whether or not we get them in those avenues, and I'm not sure our delegation is equipped as a whole to really advocate and get this in. So we'll just have to wait and see. But I think if the energy reconciliation package goes through as Majority Leader Schumer wants to do, I think that's where we'll see it most likely.
Anybody? Yes, John.
I think I know the answer, but generally speaking, for your objectives, who are your top 5 legislative allies? Not legislators, but other groups.
Well, we work with a lot of partners. You can't do this work alone, and I know I'm going to forget some partners, but certainly the Power Coalition for Equity and Justice is a table. They're a civic engagement group based in New Orleans, but really statewide, that seeks to build power and community organizing, particularly among Black and brown communities. We work closely with Together Louisiana on certain issues. We work with the United Way of Southeast Louisiana, all the United Ways, but in particular, United Way of Southeast Louisiana has been a close partner. And then we engage with a lot of other groups as well. We have a consumer healthcare coalition that we participate in and we run, actually, that Stacey works with regularly, and then we have a coalition focused on opportunity youth, youth who are aged 16 to 24, who are neither in school nor working, and so we work with a number of community partners, mostly in New Orleans, on policy solutions that will help lift up that specific population. I know I'm leaving some folks. Oh, and yeah, I completely left out. So Danny Mintz on our team, we have a safety net team that we didn't talk about, led by Dr. Daniel Mintz, that focuses on really protecting and enhancing the state safety net. And Danny runs an anti-hunger coalition comprised of, I don't know everybody who's part of that, but it's a pretty large coalition of folks that meet and coordinate on safety net issues, protecting SNAP benefits. We're working this session on a college hunger bill. That bill is by Representative Freiberg from here in Baton Rouge that got off the House floor. I believe it's waiting in the Senate. So yeah, we work in a lot of different coalitions, and as our organization has grown, so has our coalition activity. Who did I leave out? Too many to name.
Every time I talk about or hear people talk about politics, it's about the governor's race. What is the position after John Bell Edwards?
We're a nonpartisan organization with a C3 status, so I do not get involved in politics. I love to talk politics when I'm not standing at a microphone. But we know we're going to get a new governor in 2023, and we know there are 144 seats in the legislature that are on the ballot. And once we get through this session, we will sit down as a staff and we'll talk with our partners about how we can educate anybody who chooses to run for that office about the issues and policies that affect low and moderate income families. That's our mission. I think it's premature. You know, I came to Louisiana in 2003, and the very first lesson as a reporter, and the very first day we were talking about the governor's race at the Times-Picayune, and there were about 150 years of experience in that room. And the only thing anybody could agree on at that time was that Bobby Jindal and Kathleen Blanco didn't have a chance at the runoff. So anything somebody tells you this far out is probably just pure speculation. And I look forward, just as a citizen, to watching the race. I think it's going to be fascinating and open. If you like politics, an open governor's race is obviously interesting, and we'll be watching it closely.
Can I put a plug for Invest?
From a nonpartisan standpoint.
And to truly answer that, we have a platform that we've developed that we started during the 2019 gubernatorial election, which is called the Invest in Louisiana platform. It is our issue-based campaign that centers investing in our children, in our communities, and our workers, but most importantly in equity. And we have a notion that we know people in power change, and so our work is not centered around people in power, but rather around powering the people. So our issue campaign will continue. We 4 years ago, sent district fact sheets and information about our issues and research to every candidate that ran for governor and in every state legislative district. And so we'll do that again, because as I think, as John hinted, as a nonprofit, we're not interested really who wins the election. We're interested whether or not they enact policies that affect the lives of Louisianians and move us to shared prosperity. And so we're going to continue the work in the election cycle as we did in 19, really ensuring people are at the focal point of what is happening. They know the issues, and we get candidates to talk about the issues that we know really matter to Louisianians. And finally, one day, we can actually make those investments in our people, because we know the best investment in the state is made if we invest in the people of Louisiana.
All right, we have time for one more question or a comment from Jan, if he wants to make one final comment.
Once again, thank you for inviting us. Thank you for giving us this time. I really apologize for being late. It couldn't be helped, but thank you for coming, and don't forget to sign up for our Daily Dime newsletter that we send out every morning. The link is on our website.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.